Welcome to lesson 2 of Deconstructing Paul, Reconstructing Paul. I'd like to remind you that in this series, we will begin looking at the Apostle Paul in the context of first century Jerusalem, first century Israel, first century Middle East. We'll begin to see what drove Paul to be the man that he was. How did this man from Tarsus in modern-day Turkey, the son of a merchant, a Jewish man with Roman citizenship, who also had the privilege of being highly educated, how did he become the greatest missionary that Christianity has ever known? When we look at the life of Paul, we began looking at the area that he was born in, the area that he was raised in. If we go back to the 4th century, we see that the area there, Tarsus, up at where modern-day Turkey is, just north of the island of Crete, was under Greek rule. Alexander the Great had come in and brought Hellenization, had brought the culture, the society, the worship of Greek gods with him. And next, the Persians took over. You can see there that the town of Tarsus was still under rule of someone else. And then along came the Romans. And something interesting happened in Tarsus, and that was that Tarsus was granted free city status by the Romans. That meant they could make their own rules. They could elect their own government. They were not subject to Roman taxation. Therefore, they had more money, and a lot of the money from the merchants went back into the city, back into the infrastructure of the city, making it a wealthy city, making it a jewel of Asia Minor. And the city that Paul was raised in was a city in which a Jewish boy had the privilege of being a Roman citizen, something that was not easily given out. But when we think about the 1st century and we began to examine it and look at it, we began to see how very different life was in the 1st century than it is in the 21st century. The largest city in the 1st century was Rome. At the time of Paul, it had a population of about 800,000 to 1 million people. And for many of us, that might be a hard concept to kind of wrap our heads around those numbers. So let's begin to look at how Rome in the 1st century compared to some modern day cities. Today, Rome has about 2.8 million people. Tokyo has about 9.27 million people. London has 8.7 million people. New York City has 8.5 million people. And for those of us living in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, shout out to the Wolf Pack, has about 458,880 people. So we can begin to see that even though Rome was a huge metropolis of the 1st century, by today's standards, it was a small city. In the 1st century, Jewish girls were allowed to be married at 12 years of age plus 1 day. According to Jewish tradition, Jewish girls became women at the age of 12 after they had their bar mitzvah, much like the young men became men at age 12 after their bar mitzvah. So after a girl had gone through her bar mitzvah, she could be betrothed to be married. Betrothal was like an engagement period, a period of preparation before marriage. And many of these girls would be marrying young men who could be 5, 10 years older than they were, because the men would be working and would have to establish themselves and prove to the girl's family that they would be taken care of. Also, too, another interesting fact about the 1st century is that the mortality rates were extremely high. Only about 75% of the babies born in the 1st century survived their 1st year. So that's a mortality rate of about 25%. About 1 in 4 children who were born would never live to see the 1st year. And of those who did live past their 1st year, only half of those would make it to the age of 10. The father of the family had the power to decide whether or not a newborn baby would be kept. If there was too much stress on the family, if the child was going to be too big of a burden, or if the child had a physical ailment or had a physical deformity, then the father could just put the child out on the streets in hopes that someone would take that child in. Most likely someone would, and raise that child as a servant and as a slave. Women in the first century had very few rights and privileges. They were considered almost the property of their fathers and then later their husbands. What would happen was that if a woman worked, any wages that she received, if she was not married, belonged to her father. And once she was married, all wages would go to her husband. A woman did not have the right to divorce her husband, and if she tried to, she would lose her children. Any inheritances that a first century woman received from her family would go directly to her husband if she was married. The most popular sports of the day were gladiator fights and chariot races. It's been said that gladiators and chariot racers had superstar status and were known throughout all of the empire. Not only did the gladiators fight in Rome, but most of the major cities throughout the empire had stadiums that hosted gladiator fights and chariot races. There was a huge difference between the rural and city economics. Things in the city, as they are today, are usually much more expensive. In the rural areas, people freely traded their wares and their goods, and with most of the peasants in the countryside being farmers, they would trade back and forth with one another. The catchphrase of the day was Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And it was said that the Roman Empire was peaceful and you could enjoy great peace and prosperity in the Roman Empire as long as you followed Roman rules and customs, as long as you followed the Roman way of life. This was a forced peace because there were Roman guards, Roman soldiers throughout all the kingdom making sure that the people stayed in line. If anyone dared cross Rome, they would be put to death. It's been said that throughout the nation, throughout the empire, that there were crosses of thieves and those who had dared stand up to Rome. They were hung on crosses by major roadsides so that people could see what would happen. So Pax Romana was not an easy peace, but a peace that was given, that was forced upon the people. Acts 22:3. Paul said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, and I was brought up and educated here in Jerusalem under Gamaliel. As his student, I was carefully trained in our Jewish laws and customs. I became very zealous to honor God in everything I did, just like all of you today. As Paul was speaking to the Sanhedrin, to the gathered rulers of Jerusalem there, he reminded them of who he was and where he came from. Charles Swindoll, in his book, Paul, A Man of Grit and Grace, writes, John Pollock, author of The Apostle, A Life of Paul, carefully describes aspects of Saul's early life and education. Paul's parents were Pharisees, member of the party most fervent in Jewish nationalism and strict obedience to the laws of Moses. They sought to guard their offspring against contamination. Friendships with Gentile children were discouraged. Greek ideas were despised. Though Paul from infancy could speak Greek, and had a working knowledge of Latin, his family at home spoke Aramaic, the language of Judea, a derivative of Hebrew. They looked to Jerusalem as Islam looks to Mecca. Their privileges as free men of Tarsus and Roman citizens were nothing to the high honor of being Israelites, the people of promise, to whom alone the living God had revealed his glory and his plans. By his 13th birthday, Paul had mastered Jewish history, the poetry of the Psalms, and the majestic literature of the prophets. His ears had been trained to the very pitch of accuracy, and a swift brain like his could retain what he heard as instantly and faithfully as modern photographic mind retains a printed page. He was ready for higher education. A strict Pharisee would not embroil his son in pagan moral philosophy. So probably in the year that Augustus died, AD 14, the adolescent Paul was sent by sea to Palestine and climbed the hills to Jerusalem. During the next 5 or 6 years, he sat at the feet of Gamaliel, grandson of Hillel, the supreme teacher who a few years before had died at the age of more than 100. Under the fragile, gentle Gamaliel, a contrast with the leaders of the rival school of Shammai, Paul learned to dissect a text until scores of possible meanings were disclosed, according to the considered opinion of the generations of rabbis. Paul learned to debate in question and answer style known in the ancient world as diatribe, and to expound, for a rabbi was not only part preacher but part lawyer, who prosecuted or defended those who broke the sacred law. Paul outstripped his contemporaries. He had a powerful mind which would lead to a seat in the Sanhedrin in the hall of polished stones and make him a ruler of the day. So in that passage that we just read, we learn that most likely Paul had a drive to be a part of the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of the Jews. In that day, there were several Jewish groups. The biggest was the Pharisees. They were active in Palestine from the 2nd century BC through the 1st century AD. They adhered to very strict observance of the Sabbath, the rest, the purity rituals, food restrictions. They followed the law of Moses to a T. They were carefully not to harm their status as separated ones by breaking the laws of Moses. Another group in 1st century Israel religious life was the Sadducees. They were another prominent group. They were an elite group, a smaller group than the Pharisees, but they were nonetheless influential. The big difference between the two is a belief in their life and death. The Sadducees did not believe in life after death, nor in angels or any kind of spiritual world. Another group was the Essenes. They're a smaller group that lived a communal monastery-type lifestyle in Qumran near the Dead Sea. You may have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1948. The Essenes were responsible for these Dead Sea Scrolls as they wrote down all of the laws of God, as they wrote down the Old Testament. They were very interested in the idea of the apocalypse, the end of time, and light and darkness. And it's believed that some of these Essene writings were influenced John the Apostle, and it may have been that he had studied with the Essenes. There were the Herodians who supported the policies of the government of Herod, who followed him and believed that he was the right ruler and did as he said. Then there were several groups of zealots, of what we really call modern-day terrorists, people who opposed the Roman occupation of Israel. They were small groups and small bands of people. It has been said that there were some who would sneak up into groups, large groups, and stab Romans in the back and slowly fade back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. You also had the high priest, the chief priests, the Levites, the rulers, those taking care of the temples and the synagogues. You also had the scribes who were writing everything down. They were very smart men. They were agents to the rulers. But then there was this very special group, the Sanhedrin, an assembly of 23 to 71 men that were appointed in every city in Israel. They were the rulers. They were the leaders of Israel. They were like our Supreme Court. And the head of this group, as we read in that passage, was Gamaliel, the son of Simon ben Hillel, the grandson of Hillel the elder. He was a leading authority of the Sanhedrin. people looked to him and his wisdom and what he had to say. And according to tradition, Gamaliel's grandfather was one of the most important figures, the most important rabbis in Jewish history. He was associated with the development of the Mishnah and the Talmud. The Mishnah is the first written oral tradition of Judaism. They wrote down what the rabbis believed and how they had dissected Scripture and studied with God. And when we look at Acts, the 5th chapter, verses 21 through 40, we read how Gamaliel stands before the Sanhedrin, how he in his wisdom stands up for Peter and John, the apostles who had been preaching in the temple gate, in the temple courtyards, who had been arrested and miraculously rescued from jail. And Gamaliel stood before the people and said, "If it is of God, then who are we to stand against it? For we know that if it is truly from God, then it'll carry on. But if it's not from God, it'll go by the wayside." He reminded the people of how many different Jewish revolts had been led in the past and how they had all gone to the wayside because they were not of God. So as we began to think about Paul, we began to think about his life, how does it affect us? I believe that when we begin to look at this, there's some takeaways, some things that we can hold on to as we think about the life of Paul. And the first thing is to remember that no matter who you are, God can use you. We know Paul because of all his great work, of all that he had done. But ultimately, he was just another smart Jewish kid from Tarsus. Someone who had shown great promise, someone who was just a student of Gamaliel. Someone who was been part of the 72 who ruled Israel. And as impressive as it sounds, he's really, in the grand scheme of life, up to that point, he was no one. But God used him. God used him in a mighty way. He can use you. He can use me. He can use us in all of our smallness, in all our unassumingness, in all of us just being a nobody. God can use us. We also begin to see how God works in our lives through others. And God is always working, even in the lives of those who are non-Christian. We see that in Gamaliel, a good Jewish rabbi who God used to give us a great bit of wisdom, to know that when the movement is of God and when God is alive and in it, there's nothing that we can do. It is an unstoppable force that will move throughout history. And the beauty of that is knowing that there's nothing that you or I or anyone can do to stop that movement. Churches will come and go. Gatherings of people who call themselves Christians will come and go. And there will be times in which governments and peoples and organizations will try to squelch Christianity. But ultimately we know that God will take ordinary people, people who are not destined to be much of anything in the world's eyes, and will use them in great and mighty ways as they get caught up as part of this unstoppable force of proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah. And the final thing that we can see is that we are able to rise above culture, to rise above society. No matter what society says, who you are, no matter what society tells you, under God, you can be more than that. The world we live in is notorious for oppressing groups of people, but we see that God calls all people, all genders, all nationality, all races. God can use us. The things that this world uses to categorize us, things that this world uses to put us in a box, God uses to advance his kingdom. God uses as part of that unstoppable force that continues throughout the ages. So today we can rest in knowing that no matter who we are, God is using us. God is using our past. God is using everything that happens to us for His good and to make us into the people that He has called us to be. Not in a million years would I ever think that Paul would have thought that Gamaliel would have been an ally. But ultimately, Gamaliel was an ally for Christianity, as he gave us those words that we should all remember, that when it is of God, nothing can stop it.